Hey everybody, this is Gene Tiberio, and you're listening to Healing Outside the Box. I'm on episode 254, which is part 3 of my GMO series, which today will focus on unintended and possibly unknown consequences of GMO food. Another way to say this is that we don't know what we don't know. We can suspect, we can guess, we can theorize, but scientists won't lean in and say for sure that one thing causes another until there's evidence for it. Now, before I get too deep into this episode, I encourage you, if you'd like, to check out episodes 252 and 253, which gets the GMO ball rolling. What I'm trying to do here is take all this boring sciencey stuff and boil it down to basically what's important here and hopefully why it's important for us to pay attention. Now, with all organisms, and perhaps the plant world in particular, genes sometimes just get transferred from one species to another in nature. What we are doing now, and by now I mean starting about 30 years ago, is intentionally altering the natural state of organisms in a specific way, and for many different reasons. The result is that the organism can change its metabolism, its growth rate, as in the case of salmon that we talked about last week, response to the environment, or its survival. These genetic modifications can also change the order of things in nature. For example, if we set out to kill insects, do we kill some of the insects or all of the insects? And what about the animals that feed on those insects? And of course, it's only a matter of time before resistance to these insecticides create a Frankenstein insect population. What then? Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it one more time. Genetic modification is here to stay, and it can be used to cure diseases, to prevent nutrient losses, or to boost deficiencies, as in the case of, say, vitamin fortification. The elephant in the room is this. If we keep making agents that kill things, like insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, designed to kill, say, rodents, at what point does it harm us? How do we define that harm inside our complex bodies? No one has the answers right now, but many scientists are starting to think about the questions that we need to be asking. The potential health risks to humans are numerous and almost hard to define at this point. We already know about Agent Orange from our days in Vietnam in the link to cancer. Now the active ingredient in Agent Orange is currently being used as a new herbicide. Then there's the possibility of exposure to new allergens in genetically modified foods, or possibly the transfer antibiotic-resistant genes to our gut microbes, or mosquitoes that are resistant to insecticides carrying diseases, or superparasites that are difficult to kill, like ringworm, or edible plants that mistake our own cells for insect cells that it wants to kill. It's almost enough to make my head explode again. The nervous mother gene in me feels that if we are not careful, we could accidentally fall down any of those rabbit holes. Now, there's not a chance that I'm going to be able to get into depth about any of these potential unintended consequences. But for today, I will focus on 2 stories that seek to clarify some of this. The first I'll call the Superweeds story, from Roundup to dicamba, and the second is the BT corn story. Okay, the superweeds first. Genetically modified crops made to withstand the herbicide Roundup had pretty much taken over the market until, that is, superweeds sprouted up that were resistant to Roundup, so increasing the dose of Roundup did not kill them. In response to this, Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer, started using a powerful herbicide called dicamba on its crops. And like the case with Roundup, the Bayer/Monsanto were able to develop dicamba-resistant crops, starting with soybeans and cotton. But then once again, dicamba was carried in the wind and caused damage to other non-resistant crops. Farmers down the road have once again had their crops destroyed and their yields reduced because of wind-driven dicamba. Just like with Roundup. And Dow Chemical has also put their hat in the ring and produced an herbicide-resistant seed with their herbicide called 2,4-D. The active ingredient in 2,4-D is basically Agent Orange. And of course, that's drifting around too. And the weeds will inevitably become resistant to Dow's herbicide. Then in 2017, Puerto Rico was met with a devastating hurricane that wiped out their crops. Trump then gave a huge tax break to Monsanto, and Monsanto gave Puerto Rico seeds at more than likely a reduced cost. The problem was that they were forced to sign legal documents saying that they could only buy seeds from Monsanto with the herbicide that they were peddling. Now they have to buy Monsanto seeds every year at increasing prices. These GMO seeds are meant to withstand the herbicide dicamba, but as we know, they will be met with increasing resistance from the superweeds. Now you might be thinking, oh good, a new herbicide. That Roundup was a probable carcinogen. Well, folks, dicamba is a possible carcinogen. And sure enough, the NIH, which is normally conservative, has labeled it a carcinogenic risk. But as it seems already too late, much to the dismay of many scientists, in 2 years, dicamba went from 0 acres of soybeans to more than 40 million acres. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm guessing a lot. And this may not surprise you, the Dow Chemical herbicide 2,4-D is now named a possible human carcinogen from the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And once again, the herbicide 2,4-D is the same active ingredient as Agent Orange. And we all know how that went. So, should we just all throw in the towel? No, not at all. There are plenty of people out there fighting for our right to eat healthy food. More recently, in March of 2020, there was an article in The Guardian that exposed what was going on, and I'll put the link to it in the show notes. This article stated that the chemists had known for years that Monsanto/Bayer would ruin tons of farmland due to weeds that would become resistant to Roundup. The new system they have now was designed because basically millions of acres of U.S. farmland had become overrun with weeds. These weeds grew in the presence of ever-increasing levels of Roundup. Internal emails that were recently discovered stated that employees joked about hoping to, quote, stay out of jail, end quote. So they got caught with their pants down, or their jeans down in this case. And we certainly haven't heard the last from the farmers. There is a press release that talks about dicamba in direct and graphic terms. Now it appears there is little doubt that the herbicide dicamba has been linked to many different cancers. I'll give you a link to that press release in the show notes as well. That was from 2020. This time it seems farmers are fighting back. In June of 2020, Monsanto agreed to pay $10 billion in lawsuits due to the health and ecological damage caused by the herbicide Roundup. It eventually, I think, will be in their best interest to smarten up and find a way out of this. Now, the second story is the story of BT corn. This BT corn story seems to be an example of an indirect negative consequence of GMO corn. This example also shows us that the consequences may not be so obvious at first. Okay, so what is Bt corn? Bt stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. I'm probably not saying that right. So let's just call it Bt. It's a bacteria found in soil around the world. It naturally produces these crystal-like proteins that selectively kill a few specific insect species. So Bt corn, aka corn that has been modified to produce these insecticidal proteins, came into existence and did really well at first. So this strain of corn was genetically engineered to kill the larvae of beetles. So the corn in its seed contains a gene copied from this insect-killing bacteria, again called Bt. Sounds good, I think. But a scientific advisory panel warned the EPA that the threat of insects developing resistance was high. Monsanto/Bayer argued that the steps necessary to prevent resistance were unnecessary. The EPA apparently said, okay. The now famous Bt corn controversy started with a laboratory study by this guy Losey in 1999. In this study, the mortality of monarch larvae was reportedly higher when fed milkweed covered in pollen from the Bt corn than when fed milkweed covered with organic corn. The report was followed by another publication the next year suggesting that natural levels of Bt corn pollen in the fields were harmful to monarch butterflies, but they couldn't prove it. So what did I mean by indirect consequences? Here's the story. This Bt corn was modified with this gene to produce a natural insecticide to kill off those pesky beetles or locusts. Fantastic! Huzzah! Nobody likes locusts. But what about the monarch butterflies or the honeybees? They're insects too. Scientists knew at this time that the population of monarchs was dropping, but couldn't prove the Bt corn proteins were killing the butterflies. And you know how those scientists can be. They have to prove things, for goodness sake. So they couldn't prove it, yet the populations of monarchs and honeybees were in decline. So why? Well, what do monarchs feed on? In many cases, milkweed. A weed. What do honeybees like, among other things? Goldenrod, another weed. And this corn was also genetically modified to withstand the weed killer Roundup, so that hundreds of miles of industrial farmland could be aerial sprayed with tons of Roundup, a weed killer. And now, of course, dicamba, another weed killer. And 2,4-D, another weed killer. This kills plants both on and around the farm, where winds can carry what's in the air. And dicamba has been known to transform in the air into a gaseous form, which means it's going to blow even further. And unlike small family farms in the old days, industrial farms don't leave acres of fields to grow wild and feed those honeybees. And I guess goldenrod is a big deal because it provides sustenance for the bees to survive the winter as it blooms in the fall. Okay, so the elimination of the weeds around herbicide-resistant croplands may be responsible for a lower bee population than with the organic crops. I bet you can guess what happened next. A new generation of insect larvae is eating the roots of these genetically engineered Bt corn plants, intended to be deadly to these pests. The monumental failure of Monsanto's genetically modified Bt corn could be, as one scientist said, the most serious threat ever to a genetically modified crop in the U.S. So we have superweeds and super insects. So resistance is a thing. I'll put a link to the NIH article in the show notes. There was another article put out by NIH that suggests there may be more complicating factors yet unknown. Our little buzzing bees are subjected to many pressures in the 21st century. The abundance and diversity of wildflowers has declined. Bees are now chronically exposed to chemicals, and they are also exposed to novel parasites accidentally spread by 350 million Americans. In addition, climate change is likely to exacerbate these problems in the future. And these stress factors don't act in isolation. Scientists are telling us that pesticide exposure can hurt the honeybee's immune system, making it then more susceptible to parasites. It seems that chronic exposure to multiple interacting stress factors is driving the honeybee colony losses and declines in other wild pollinators like bumblebees. But as the scientists put it, such interactions are not addressed by current regulations. Studying these stressors in nature poses a challenge because it's hard to eliminate all other factors. What we could do is we could encourage lawmakers to listen to the scientists once again in this matter. The scientists would know how to incorporate land designed for wildflowers that also support the life of these honeybees. The land designated for the flowers could go throughout and around farmlands. Keeping farmland sustainable and supporting organic farmers financially seems like a no-brainer as well. Following and monitoring the population of these bee pollinators would help to keep track of any potential unintended consequences of our industrial farming practices. Here's a quote from that NIH article. Quote, "These issues are increasingly important to consider as the number of GMOs continues to increase due to improved laboratory techniques and tools for sequencing whole genomes, better processes for cloning and transferring genes, and improved understanding of gene expression systems. Thus, legislative practices that regulate this research have to keep pace." End quote. Well, amen to that. Although we have moved the goalposts over the past 40 years, the goal should be the same: to support the life of the birds and the bees and us. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.